Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. Before we get to today's episode, we want to take a quick moment and let you know that CityWorks Expo 8, anticipating 2050, acting today, will be occurring October 4th through 6th in Roanoke, Virginia. We've got some really exciting speakers and some other activities lined up that we're excited about. If you all are interested, please check us out at cityworksexpo.com. That's cityworksexpo.com. But now, without further ado, let's get on to today's episode.
Please listen carefully.
Welcome to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. My name is Brad Stevens, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our guest today, Miss Alexandra Lange, an architecture critic and author of several books, including The Design of Childhood, which will be out today as this is launched, and then previously writing about architecture, mastering the language of buildings and cities. How are you doing today, Alexandra?
I'm great. It's a beautiful day in New York.
Well, very good. Although if it's anything like it is down here in Virginia, it's a little too warm for my taste at this point in the year, but what can you do?
Yeah, it's never perfect.
Well, I wonder, Alexandra, if you can start us off by kind of defining how you view your work and what you do.
Well, I'm nominally an architecture critic, and to some people that means that I just write very specifically about buildings and say whether they're good or bad. But I really define it much more broadly than that. I write about the built environment and design, from small things like the design of scissors to big things like the design of city parks. What's important to me and what I take from the history of architecture criticism is a real attention to the experience and details that make those things work or not for cities. I really almost always write about places that I've visited myself. I try to walk around. I try to look at what people are doing. And a lot of times I'm directed by things about places or things about the way people are talking about places that just bother me, like little kind of like itches in my mind. Like, why aren't people asking about that? Or does that really work the way they said it was going to work? And so when those kind of voices or irritations become loud enough, then I think, okay, it's time for me to really look into this and do the research and write a piece.
So what was it then that led you to write about children and their space in this?
Yes, well, I had a child, and suddenly I felt like my house and my life were inundated with things that I hadn't necessarily chosen. You know, people kindly sent me gifts of toys and other baby gear, and I started spending a lot of time on playgrounds, which I'd never spent time on before. In New York, you can't actually go to a playground without a child. So they were places in the city that I hadn't really focused on or experienced. And once I had gone to, say, 3 or 4 playgrounds, I started thinking, well, why does the equipment look the same at all of these playgrounds? Like, why are they like this? And as a design critic, I'm trained to kind of listen to myself when I'm asking those questions, and then do the research. And I feel like the book really follows the path of children's development, and then follows the path of my development as a parent into doing the research. Like, why do the playgrounds all look alike? Well, the answer is that the New York City Parks Department, because of safety regulations, generally orders new equipment from about 3 different catalogs. So sometimes I was actually looking at exactly the same piece of equipment ordered from the same catalog, even though I was in a different location in the city.
Has this, has having a child now and looking at these things differently, has it kind of changed your perception on what makes a successful place or not?
Definitely, because now I think my idea of who it needs to be successful for is much broader. A lot of times nowadays we see new urban areas, and I feel like they're really designed for millennials, or I would say, people, working people without children who are probably there mostly, during the day, and not so much on weekends. And now I guess I just see a broader constituency for public space, children, families, older people, and I feel like having children took me out of myself a little bit and out of the blinders that you can sometimes have to your own status, and allowed me to see, the public spaces have to work for more different kinds of people at more different times.
It's interesting. I had Cade Benfield on this podcast a while ago, and he mentioned this thing about indicator species for our communities, that for him, if children and the elderly were working well and could get around our cities well, and we saw them, that was probably an indication that those places were working well. And having had a child myself, that resonated in a way that I never would have thought it would before.
Yeah, no, and I have a version of that quote that Enrique Peñalosa, the Bogota mayor, said. There are a lot of different versions of that quote floating around, but no, I absolutely believe that. I mean, it comes down to even just things like the timing of crosswalk signals. Can you walk across the street comfortably, holding a small child's hand, or as an elderly person who may have a slower gait, and not be rushed and not feel threatened? These are the things that make a city comfortable for everyone and make a city comfortable for the whole span of people's lives. And if we're not thinking about anyone but, 25 to 35-year-olds in absolute, top health, then it's really working for a very narrow part of the population.
Do you think that this time when there was an expectation that when you have children, you move out to the suburbs and enjoy that suburban existence, has kind of allowed cities to get away from having to plan for children being in their cities?
I think there was just an assumption in the post-war era that families, if they had the means, would move to the suburbs, that was where families should go. And as we've seen over the past 10 years, many, many more people want to stay in cities. They want to have a car-free or a car-light lifestyle. They like all the amenities. They don't want to have a long commute. And so I think, cities are realizing that they need to retrofit themselves for families. And then I also think the flip side of that is that suburbs, which were kind of designed for private family life and car access, are also starting to think about urbanizing themselves and trying to provide some of the walkability of cities. So I think, in a way, there's redevelopment and rethinking it at both ends of that spectrum of housing.
Well, I want to take a little bit of a step back here before we get too deep in this, and just ask, kind of, when you think about design, or when you're thinking in that way, how do you kind of define that term and what that means in these spaces that we're talking about?
The term design?
Mm-hmm.
Gosh. I mean, I feel like from time to time it could mean almost anything in a way. I mean, it can mean, the timing of walk signals. It could also mean, a raised crosswalk as opposed to a flat crosswalk. In a park, it can mean, often we talk about, so how can we make people spend more time in parks? Well, it's good to have benches. It's good to have shade. So then you're talking about the design of the bench, but you're also talking about the trees and where the trees are being planted. And so I think, design can be really material things and also ephemeral things. So it's really all parts of the experience. And it's, in a way, sometimes it's my word count that makes me focus on one aspect of it above another, because you can't talk about everything.
Well, and I think this is, that's part of the reason why I think this is an important question, is I want to get, those people that are listening or whoever might come across this to just think about, I had Justin Garrett Moore on the podcast a while ago, and when I asked him to define what design was, it was this very expansive, or what his purview was this very expansive thing where it's like someone that doesn't necessarily feel comfortable talking about design, they can be like, oh, well, if that's design, then that's very much in my space. And I think that there is this kind of, in some ways, I don't want to say elitist isn't quite the right word, but design feels like, something arty and something that most people can't engage with, but it's really much bigger than that, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, I definitely see it that way. I mean, if you're thinking about design as objects in the Museum of Modern Art's design collection, I mean, I love all those things, and, I can identify lots of them from memory. But I'm much more interested now in a more expansive and democratic definition of design, because that's where it's going to help the most people. And I think, even the people that created those objects in museum collections, many of them, have really utopian ideas about making things that work better for the largest number of people. And that's why, in general, when I'm writing about design, I try to write about public space. I try to write about things that are inexpensive, things that are accessible, because, there's not so much point in writing about things that most people are never going to get to see or touch. If you have the kind of, agenda that I have, which is that everyone we all need to be critical of our environment, and we all need to push for more accessibility and more ease in our lives through the public environment as well as the private environment.
Well, I wonder, kind of to build on that a little bit, why do you think it is so important that we have that critical lens and we look so deeply into what is around us and the design of things that we encounter every day?
Well, I think things can always be improved, and I don't see how they can be improved unless we, look at them with a sharp eye. I mean, some people think of criticism as just being negative, but I write plenty of pieces that are about great things that people are doing. But I think the point of criticism is to really try to identify and articulate what is working and what is not, because I think that's where you find the lessons for future projects. If you can really kind of hone down and okay, so, this playground, which is attracting more children, why is that? Well, the play structures appeal to a wider span of ages. There's more seating for adults. It's near a coffee kiosk, so people can get a snack. All of these things start to work together, and unless you identify what those elements are and say, yes, this is good, then you can't replicate that elsewhere. And, some people can do that. I think critics are trained to really kind of break it apart and analyze what's going on from a spatial point of view, and the narrative of that is a teaching tool, and also it's something that hopefully other people kind of internalize and can use in their own lives.
That's really fascinating from the perspective of, so I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I don't know if you've ever been to Charlottesville, but they're famed for this downtown walking mall that they have where they've taken one of the main streets.
I've heard about it, yeah.
And so that's obviously, it's been hugely successful for Charlottesville, but I'm not sure, I am sure that for a lot of other places it's not worked fairly successfully to do essentially that same project. And I'm wondering if that's in some ways because when they've broken apart that design, they think, okay, we just create a walkable mall. They're not seeing those intricacies of that design in terms of, there's a library close by, and that there's a university in town that allows for a certain subset of people that want to be in this kind of space, and those different characteristics that sometimes we don't always delve enough into that complexity to know what is replicable in new places.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good observation, because it's true. Pedestrian malls have not been successful in a lot of places, and a lot of cities that put them in, say in the 1970s, have taken them out again. So you can look at it from a pure design perspective, of, the pedestrian mall and the kind of paving they have and all of that. But then you're right. It depends on kind of what other public services are in the area, how people get there. Do they drive into town and park, and where do they park? And then the student population means there are a lot more people probably that are pedestrians or are on bikes than there may be in another city of the same size. And so they flock to a place like that. I'm just thinking of another successful pedestrian mall is if there's one in Burlington, Vermont, which has a little bit of the same setup with a high student population. So I would say, sometimes the factors are, design factors, like the architects picked pavement that gets too hot in the summer, so nobody wants to be there, or something like that. But sometimes it's social factors, like there are more pedestrians and cyclists because it's a university town, or and so the more you know and the more places you visited, the more you can try to make those connections and say, Burlington is like Charlottesville, but it's not like downtown Fort Worth or whatever.
We'd like to take a moment now to say thank you to our sponsors today. The Urban Affairs and Planning program at Virginia Tech's School of Public and International Affairs offers an interdisciplinary approach to understanding planning and policy for megaregions, cities, suburbs, and rural regions in the U.S. and abroad. UAP faculty have expertise in urban planning, architecture, urban design, economics, geography, political science, law, technology, and engineering, and provide students with a multifaceted understanding of how communities grow and change. Students apply their knowledge and professional skills by participating in real-world problem-solving with community clients through project-based studios and applied research. UAP emphasizes technical analysis and policy evaluation in approaching the complexities of modern communities. So big thanks today to the Urban Affairs and Planning program down at Virginia Tech for being our sponsor. If you'd like to hear more, check them out online. But without further ado, we'll get back to today's guests. Thank you. Can we think of the built infrastructure as something that impacts us and moves us forward, while at the same time recognizing that it was a reflection of who we were when we built that space? Because those seem in some ways to be pulling against each other in some form.
Yeah. Well, I think no matter how much sometimes I, as somebody who, knows a fair amount about architecture history, kind of want to preserve a space, like understand its intentions, want it to stay the same because it was beautiful or because it was designed by a famous architect. I think we definitely need to recognize that, demographics and times and technology and things have changed, and that spaces need to be able to change with them. Sometimes I get frustrated when I think we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, in the sense that, cities sometimes reject something just because it's old and it's gotten sort of worn, when it could be restored and it could be put to new use. It doesn't need to be, demolished. But I think the social factors are always with us in architecture. And though, there's kind of a stereotype, as I mentioned earlier, of architecture criticism just focusing on the building, I think the best architecture critics, people like Ada Louise Huxtable, that I always looked up to, who used to be the critic for the New York Times, people like her were always aware of the urban factors, of who was going to be using it. And that was just part of any evaluation, was like, how is it going to work in the city?
Well, that's interesting in terms of, I think we're reaching this space where when I talk about placemaking or urbanism or any of those kind of catchphrases, that we're recognizing that we need to bake social equity and social justice in some ways into the very core of those entities if we want to use them moving forward. And I'm wondering if you guys are kind of seeing the same move in the design and architecture world, that equity questions need to be at the forefront when we think about these buildings and this infrastructure.
Oh, definitely. I think that, for any big public project, for public parks now, equity is one of the first things that people are talking about, both in the design community and in the, community sort of community organizations that are pushing for these amenities. Just as one example, the High Line here in New York has been phenomenally successful and now is almost a victim of its own success because it's so crowded. And there have been a lot of equity questions around it that it doesn't serve its local community well enough. And I think, those were not anticipated and probably could not have been anticipated by the original organizers, but now the people that backed the High Line have created a group of people who are trying to get similar infrastructure parks made in other cities, and so that they can all share knowledge about a variety of things. And one of the things they're sharing knowledge about is equity. So, that's how you learn from experience, and that's how you make the next park do a better job at making sure that, the housing nearby doesn't become unaffordable for large numbers of people. Make sure that there is a kind of programming that's good for children and not just for tourists. Or, all of these things can be addressed if you understand the lay of the land. And so it's great when people from different cities can share that knowledge. So everyone doesn't have to learn the same lessons for themselves.
That's really, I had a conversation with someone recently, and we were talking about how, when we build something and it doesn't work the way we expect it to, or we have these problems with it, that we need to not necessarily feel bad about doing it, but we need to learn from it and move forward. And so that's particularly, I think, perhaps true in this world where, something like the High Line that cost, millions and millions of dollars to build is not something that we can just turn around and change overnight or even dismantle if it's problematic. But we need to learn from that for other places. I wonder kind of how, are there methods by which those communities communicate with one another to let each other know what some of the impacts have been for these kind of projects?
Well, in this case, I think, it was the leadership of the High Line that felt like a lot of people in other cities were kind of unofficially coming to them for advice because, that project has been so successful. Everything is supposed to be the next High Line. So they thought, well, why don't we, make this into a proper group, so we don't have to repeat ourselves, so that people can also learn from each other. There's lateral learning. It wasn't, so it's not just them preaching to the next generation. I think that is a great example of one way to organize it. I think it's also great if, the parks groups can, publish their findings, can do post-occupancy studies, can really be mindful about what happens after that first wave of publicity and the opening happens, and try to, make different forums for sharing that information. It's easy, especially in the architecture and design press, to kind of forget about things after that moment of opening. But obviously the people running those parks, are still doing it, and they could, set up a forum, on their website, on Facebook, by some other means, to share what they've learned and kind of what they've changed 5 years later or 10 years later, in response to what happened after that opening day.
Interesting. Well, I wonder. I want to move us back towards some of the questions from your book here that's coming out today when we launch this. Sure. But I'm wondering, kind of, it's as I was reading through it, I was struck by the, this kind of theme that I think is, I don't know if you ever really came out and said it other than, in the subtitle being how the material world shapes independent kids, but there's this very clear undertone that we want our children to be independent, and that's the best way to raise children. I'm kind of wondering, that's not necessarily something that I think everyone assumes, and I'm wondering why you think that's so important in some ways.
Well, I feel like in the past decade, there's been a lot of focus on, kind of what kids are learning from technology, what kids are learning in schools, like, do they have the skills? Are they learning to read? And there's been kind of a tunnel vision on the content, kind of on what's before them at screen size or book size or page size. But if you look at design history, there's a tremendous amount of discussion about what's going on around that page. Like, what kind of chair are they sitting on? What kind of classroom are they sitting in? How long are they sitting there? How much recess time do they have? And so I felt like the physical environment and what children learn from, physical play, whether that is with blocks or sports or on the playground, was kind of getting lost. And I was worried that it would be lost, that we'd sort of send our children into these dark rooms with like educational iPads and they would never get out. The analogy I always make is in the movie Wall-E, all the people that go on the Starliner to drift in space until the planet has, replenished itself, they end up in these reclining chairs and they're just turning into fat blobs. Because the machines are doing everything for them. And so I felt like, in a kind of science fiction way, I could see this happening with children in education. There's a tremendous problem with kids not getting enough time outdoors, kids, childhood obesity, all of this stuff. And it's like, well, okay, but we have a solution for that, which is more outdoor play. So maybe what we should be looking at is why aren't kids playing outdoors? And the reasons for that are physical and structural. They're about, the way our cities are set up. They're about the way play areas are set up. They're about the way we kind of confined children to a children-only space where, if, we look at some other examples of city planning, space has been made safe, space has been made connected, and there's a lot more opportunity for children to be independent. And if children have more opportunity to be independent, they want to go outside. There's more for them to do, and it's way more appealing than it is in a lot of places now.
Well, there is a a psychological component of that too, I suppose, in terms of parents not encouraging their kids to play outside and or not even wanting their kids to play outside. But that's is how do those kind of work together in terms of, do you think that there's a way to design that in a way that makes parents feel better about sending their kids outside to play, or that the safety issue is removed from their mind in some ways, or does it even have to be a little bit unsafe for kids to learn what they need to learn from it?
Well, yeah, I guess I'd say yes to both of those things. I mean, the first question is about safety, and there's been a lot of discussion, especially by Lenore Skenazy, who set up the kind of free-range kids movement, about how there's this weird fixation on children being kidnapped if they're allowed to go outside alone, and the percentage chance of that happening is very, very low. But I feel like, as many parents, or I as a parent who lives in Brooklyn, like, I'm not so worried about the kidnapping. I'm worried about the cars. As the SUVs are associated with a higher level of fatalities for children, cars go faster now. A lot of streets, the walk signals are short. The intersections are not daylit. There are a whole range of like street safety issues. So I'm most worried about my kid getting hit by a car, honestly. So I think if we start to redesign our streetscapes to make them safer for everybody, that would help a lot in terms of giving children more independence. If we start thinking about neighborhoods and what are safe routes for kids to walk and bike to those playgrounds, maybe we have more shared streets. I mean, so there's a whole range of discussion about kind of who gets to dominate the streets, who are they designed for? Is it people or cars? That I think would make a tremendous difference in terms of parents feeling like they could kind of let their children off the leash. And then the other aspect of that is designing some spaces where children can play, where they could have more risk, or there's age-appropriate risk. I was at a new playground in Brooklyn today, and there was, one climbing structure that said recommended for ages, 1 to 5. And there was another climbing structure that said recommended for ages 5 to 12. And that's, that's covering their butts in terms of liability. But it's also like, well, what happens after age 12? Do you really not want to climb on anything anymore? I don't think so. You're a teen and a tween, and I feel like a lot of teens and tweens love to climb on things. They love to skateboard. They try parkour, all of this stuff. So is there another size of playground that we could build in some places to give those kids a challenge so that they aren't climbing on things that are actually dangerous, like the undersides of highways or something like that? That's like skate parks are, I think, the best manifestation of, kind of playgrounds for teens, but not everyone wants to skateboard. So things like that, there are risks. They would be bigger. There would be, longer falls, higher jumps, taller walls to climb, but they would still be within what, play safety experts thought was a reasonable, kind of a reasonable risk.
Built on that, we don't build things for, 12 and up. Do you think that is in some way we as a society don't necessarily want to encourage those folks to play anymore? We want to encourage them to transition into being adults. Is that some of what you think is leading to that not happening at that age?
Well, I think there is a wish for teenagers to behave more like adults, but I think that wish is forcing teenagers to, stay indoors in a way that isn't healthy for them, and it's not. It's not a wish that we should have. It's sort of treating teenagers as something as people that you'd rather not see, and I think that's destructive to to their self-esteem, to their health, and it's frankly unfair. My book doesn't really talk about teenagers, but I've been doing some reporting about teenagers, first about teenagers and outdoor public space, and then recently I wrote an article about teen spaces in libraries as one of the only free public indoor spaces where teens are welcomed. I think it's really important to kind of embrace adolescence as a natural part of life. Teenagers are not children; they're not adults. They have a particular, a particular hormonal agenda. Their brains are wired a certain way, and they need spaces where they can be themselves. And to act otherwise is asking for trouble.
That's really, fascinating. We're based in Roanoke, Virginia, and I'm work out of a co-working space that's in a very nice village center area. It's a very vibrant area. But for a while, a couple of years ago, there were a number of complaints because there were teenagers gathering in the area. And there's a story about one of them spitting on someone and all this stuff. And it was this incredible fear-mongering campaign of like, we have to get these teenagers out of this space. They're so dangerous. And it was like, well, they're going to go play video games. That's the alternative. And we complain about them when they do that too. So where do we do?
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's like, where do you want them to go? It's like there's a sense that people don't want them to be anywhere, and that's just, it seems, demeaning and destructive. It's like those teenagers are somebody's children. Those teenagers will eventually be all of our children. And can't we create spaces with more understanding? Maybe they need to be separate than adult spaces, but, why were they hanging out in the space of your co-working space? Was it because there was no public library option? Was it because they were kicked out of the mall? You have to get to the root of the problem and figure out what it is that they need. In one of my stories, I wrote about a bunch of different architecture firms that had started, teen summer programs or teen internship programs that were actually teaching teenagers, the language of architecture and some techniques of architecture so that they could better advocate for themselves. And I thought that was great. One person said to me, teenagers are really smart and they have fewer filters than adults have. And so they make great design critics. They make great planners because they're just filled with ideas. And so if you can create, the time and the space for them to kind of learn some terms and share their ideas, they're a great resource for cities.
I live by this belief that we haven't quite figured out the answers to the big questions that we face, whether that be, how to deal with poverty, how to deal with homelessness, how to educate children best. And so it is, as soon as we shut down those teenagers, in some ways, you're losing the potential for a vast amount of knowledge, because they don't have the filters, and they're not trained to shut down ideas immediately. And so it's fascinating, I think, what we can do when we empower people, particularly young people, to do things.
Yeah. Well, and I think, kids have some of that too. I used to do a lot of arts and crafts and making when I was younger, and I kind of got out of that when I was in my 20s, and I was writing all the time. And it's been great for me to go back to, art classes with my kids, and the way that they just, kind of pick up the materials and start making. I feel like that's the pure kind of state of flow that people talk about in creative work. That's like the brainstorming frame of mind where you don't say no to everything. All of these kind of techniques that have now been co-opted by business and design thinking. Like, kids are so great at that. And so, one of the great things for me about having kids is I felt like they clarified a lot of my thinking, and also I learned from them. Because I remembered, how I used to be, or how I used to, just don't worry about it, just do it. And, with your kids rushing you, sometimes you don't have a choice. So that was a benefit of doing this research, was I also, found people who had done studies about kind of what I was observing in my own life. And that was great as a parent, and then also as a design critic. So it's like, okay, follow the children, look at what they're doing. And one thing that I talk about in the book is, child study, that branch of child psychology spends a lot of time observing children, but I found a lot of people who designed really interesting toys or designed really interesting playgrounds and basically made themselves into amateur child study experts. They went, before they designed a school, they went and sat in schools and sketched, so the children would come over and ask about what they were sketching, and they could share ideas, different techniques to kind of connect with children. And it was like, okay, so the people that design the best things for children are the people that somehow are able to put themselves back in the child's shoes and kind of hang out with children in a non-threatening way and learn, and then take that back to their professional life. And it was just interesting to see that kind of biographical detail come up again and again in different people's lives.
Interesting. I'm intrigued as well by this concept that you kind of bring up towards the end of your book about the kind of cyclical nature that these things that you posit that they work in terms of, during the 80s we had this commercialization and safety, really safety conscious move, and you're speculating that we're maybe moving away from that a little bit. And I'm kind of wondering what leads you to believe that we're moving away from that, and what kind of gives you hope about the future of design for children?
Well, I feel like, yes, I do feel like there's been this cyclical nature of kind of progressivism, and then a retrenchment and, focus on standards or numbers. And I guess I feel like things like the free-range kids movement, things like the turn towards making and maker spaces, things like really just like the uptick in people talking about play in all sorts of different ways. The Lego Foundation is looking at play. Arup, the international engineering firm, just issued a report on children in cities. I feel like in the 3 years since I've been working on this book, I just see more and more, fairly powerful institutions talking about the need for kids to be outdoors more, the need for kids to have risks. So it feels to me like all of these things put together are saying, okay, we went too far in the other direction. We put our kids inside with iPads, with books, and didn't think about the physical aspect of their lives. And so now, we need to do things a different way. People are not happy with how the options their children are being given. Children are not happy with the options they've been given. And hopefully all of these forces will work together and, take us back to some of the actually, terrific innovations of mid-century. I'm particularly fond of these adventure playgrounds or junk playgrounds that let kids essentially make their own playground with, tools and trash. And they have them all over cities, including New York City. So I always feel like if you're advocating for something, if you can point to the fact that, we already had it, or we had it once before, it's a historical pattern, it really helps. We're not proposing something new. We're saying we used to have these playgrounds, they worked fine, then they went away. Can we bring them back?
Well, I wonder, on the flip side, I'm sure you've run into these folks, although hopefully not had to spend too much time around, because I think they tend to be pretty boring people. But the folks that want to say, no, we need to format our education and such that our children come out and they can get jobs afterwards. And I'll share from personal experience that my 9-month-old daughter goes to a Montessori school, and everything she does is a job. And it drives me nuts.
Right.
No, you're not doing jobs. That's ridiculous. I don't want play, have fun. Don't do jobs. That's it. But that whole thing, and so there is this kind of movement that's I still think has a fair amount of force, especially if you look at universities where the liberal arts are being cut all the time in favor of engineering and things like that. So how do you kind of tell people that no, we need to really scale it back and focus on raising independent kids that can think creatively and be, I think, better citizens? But how do you kind of frame that conversation?
Yeah, well, I think part of that conversation is you have to start from the premise of the fact that we don't actually know what the jobs are going to be like when our children grow up. I mean, you have a small child, I have small children. 10 years from now, what are the top jobs going to be? I don't think we know. Now, I don't think people necessarily like to admit that, but that's the truth. And so if you're preparing kids for a future in which you don't know what the jobs will be, independent thinking seems to me to be the best way to prepare them, because they'll be flexible, because they'll be analytical. And maybe, yes, they have to learn to do math, but they'll also, know how to make things. They'll also, know how to write things. And so, communication, making, as well as, more concrete skills, some combination of those is going to be helpful. So maybe, it's not about specializing, but about broadening our education. And I mean, you're absolutely right about universities, but I think in this case, it may be early childhood education and elementary education that start to lead the way back. As people find out, okay, now we have all these engineers, but we need people who understand the ethics of engineering, or can make this engineered object into something beautiful that people actually want to use. I mean, there have always been soft skills associated with those hard skills, and we have to make sure there are people learning those skills as well.
Well, I love that way of looking at it, and as someone who really enjoyed going to a liberal arts school, I hope that we can get back to that space at some point soon.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead, yeah. Sorry.
Oh, my parents were professors, so they never talked to me about jobs at all. They just always thought it would work out, which seems funny now because I don't know if anyone quite thinks that way, but I appreciate it, because who would ever, raise their child to be an architecture critic?
Well, it's true enough. I think I was incredibly empowered by the fact that both my mom and dad went to graduate school for environmental studies, and neither of them does anything related to that degree. And so it was very empowering. It was like, hey, you go to school to learn how to be a person and not to learn some particular skill set that you're going to do for the rest of your life. And I found it to be incredibly empowering personally. So.
Yeah. No, that's much more the way I was raised, and it's not the way people talk about things today, but we may get back there, or to a new version of that.
Well, I'm also intrigued because I think that there was a subcurrent that I was very interested in your book as well about the gendering of children's spaces and how they almost all have been created as women's spaces or spaces that we usually think of as women being in. And I'm wondering kind of how you see a way out of that, or if you see that changing at all.
Do I see it? Well, I guess I feel like spaces for small children are still gendered women. I mean, if you look at the statistics about, who are children's and young adult librarians, who is teaching, in elementary and middle schools, it's still, by a large majority, women. I don't, and unfortunately, that also tends to come with people not necessarily being paid what they're worth. Like many female-dominated professions are, among the lower paid professions, even though we would all say that education was, one of the most important jobs. So, I mean, that's just an ongoing problem in America. One thing I really appreciated as I researched and wrote my book was that a lot of times in architecture and design, you don't have an opportunity to talk about so many women because those professions are still dominated by men. But when I came to look at spaces for children, there were so many more women because that was a place where women were considered experts. So, I mean, I appreciated it as a historian and a feminist and just that I didn't have to look so hard for women, or I didn't have to worry about having that balance in my book. But ultimately, I think we have to achieve a better gender balance. I know, my older child is a boy, and I'm always happy when he has a male teacher. Kids are different. Different kids respond to different kinds of people. And I think, there's I don't want to be a gender essentialist. Like there are plenty of female teachers that can connect to my son, male teachers that connect to my daughter. It's not about that. It's just about having as wide a span of people as possible working with children, because you never know which teacher is going to really connect with your child and kind of give them the key to unlock, what's going to drive them to teach themselves.
I wonder, this is a question that I like to ask folks, but and get a wide variety of answers on. But I'm wondering, as you were researching for this book or whatever project you've been working on recently, is there something that's really been surprised you and changed the way that you've thought about something?
I think in researching this book and research I'm still doing, I'm often surprised by kind of how out there people were in the past. Just for one example, when I was researching the book, I found just kind of a stray reference to there being a toy lending library in New York that was started in the late 1920s. And I thought, a toy lending library? Like, what is that? I mean, that's not even something that we necessarily have today. And just recently I had an opportunity to follow up on that, and I found that there were actually 3 or 4 toy lending libraries, and they were started by children's charities in the depths of the Depression because they felt like impoverished children should also have an opportunity to play. So it was sort of like, okay, we have libraries for books, we have playgrounds for outdoor play, but there's this other category, this category of physical play, pretend play, building play, that poor children are not having the opportunity to do. So we need to have a lending library for blocks and dolls. And that that was so close to, my rationale for writing this book and my emphasis on the physical world and how children need, physical objects and physical spaces to learn and grow, that I felt like I was on the right track. And I was also kind of amazed that they were using this developmental language way back then, and had this great mechanism to make change. You brought up equity before, and here this was like toy equity in 1929, and I wouldn't have thought that was possible. But again, it's like if you can look to the past, often you can find examples of what you've been looking for. And then it's much easier to build on a foundation that someone else has already created.
You're bringing up distinct memories of my childhood, because in Charlottesville we had a game lending library that I distinctly remember going to and always wanting to get Candyland out of the lending library, which I had no idea was such a rare thing. At the time, it was like, this is so cool that we have this, and then it disappeared, and now I'm like, well, that was not a common thing that we had then. So interesting.
Yeah, now I'm going to look that up for my for my story. But that's funny. I hate Candyland. But yes, the children love it. It's one of those things as a parent, sometimes you have to grit your teeth and just play a game of Candyland.
Yes, exactly. It's your kids don't always pick the most exciting toy to play with, so.
No, I know, and you can't make them like the same toys as you do. But that's fine. It's good for you. None of us should always get our own way,
That is absolutely true. There's nothing that will teach you humility like a child. I think that is
exactly
one of the biggest lessons from little Evelyn. But I wonder, as we get close to the end here, Alexandra, I wonder if you could kind of share, when you go to a new place or when you're looking at a community, when you get off that plane or get out of that car in a place, what is the things that you look for to let you know whether a place is thriving and whether they've started to really figure things out, or whether it's a place that's kind of struggling and maybe doesn't have the best design or hasn't really moved forward in some ways?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I always want to do is get to my hotel and drop my bag and then walk around. And so I guess I tend to evaluate places first and foremost by can I walk around? Are there sidewalks around where they've put me? Can I walk to a place for lunch? Is there a nice place to sit outside and eat? So, that kind of walkability and connectivity, and, does the streetscape seem like something that people have spent time, trying to make comfortable and useful? Or do I feel like the sidewalks are really narrow and the cars are just whooshing by? It's funny, I was in Phoenix earlier this year, and I was in a hotel downtown, and there, was a really nice marketplace to go and get lunch in, and a green median and all of this stuff. But I was feeling like all of the cars as I was walking down the street were really close. And I realized that in New York, in residential neighborhoods, there are usually street trees, which, kind of give you a buffer zone from the cars. There's usually a parking lane of cars on wider streets. And so I don't, in my daily life, I'm not often walking down a narrow sidewalk where the cars are literally, 2 feet from me. But in downtown Phoenix, the streets are 6 lanes wide, and the sidewalk is, just seems incredibly narrow, and, there aren't parked cars and there aren't street trees and all of that. So it's like, even though things were close and I could have that kind of walkable experience, it didn't necessarily feel like I was supposed to be having that walkable experience. And I think this is a topic of conversation in Phoenix now. They're building new parks, they have great public libraries, all this stuff, but what is it like when you're trying to get between those places? Is part of a new conversation.
Very interesting. Walkability seems to be a common thread that comes up in this question, and so I think everybody's looking for different things, but if you can't walk, then in some ways it doesn't matter what other great things you have. Yeah. No, I definitely think that's true. I mean, I'm spoiled because I've lived in New York for a long time. I don't even bike that much because usually I walk and take public transportation, and generally that is convenient, which I know is not true for most other places in the country. But I think a lot of people's lives would be better if they could walk to more things. Well, could you close us out with a story of what happens when a community really understands design well and starts to make it work for the people that live there, and how that can affect the community as a whole?
One of the places that I visited when I was researching my book was Vancouver, because they've had family-friendly family-friendly housing policies for a long time, since the 1970s. They've tried to create new developments that would be focused around families, have family-size apartments, make sure that there were community centers and eventually schools within walking distance, and also creating building designs that, weren't single-family homes, but also weren't all high-rises and often had some form of kind of semi-private courtyard. So that there was essentially like a stepping stone of public space between your unit and a balcony or a little yard, this semi-public, semi-private space, and then, the sidewalk and the public park. And so when I went there, I was able to go to these developments that were created in the 70s, very 70s architecture, in fact, that were still working well for a lot of people. In fact, they worked so well that nobody was moving out, and so that was creating its own set of problems. But a lot of times, to me, planning ideas can be very abstract. And so it was really great to be able to go and experience a community and actually, get toured a bit by kids who are living in that community and see, these planning ideas that I had read about in a book come to life and be embodied by those children. And the children were actually super articulate about, kind of what games they played in the courtyard and how they could walk to this corner store and buy candy, and they didn't have to cross any streets. It was like everything they said was just like checking off all the boxes that I had for a family-friendly community. And I think it's so important to be able to experience that, kind of not just in an ideal world, but in the real world.
Well, hopefully we can all be more like Vancouver moving forward. But Alexandra, where can people find your book or more information about what you're up to?
Well, I have a website, alexandralange.net, that has my book and links to events. The book is available on Amazon or at an independent bookstore near you. I hope that people will look it up, and I hope that people will also advocate for change around families in their own communities.
Wonderful. And if people are interested in learning more about CityWorks Expo, you can find us at cityworksxpo.com. But thank you again so much for taking the time today, Alexandra.
Thank you.
Once again, thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. We truly hope you've enjoyed today's episode and come away thinking more deeply about something than you were before. If you have, we'd appreciate a rating or review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you might be listening to this. It really helps other people find out about the podcast and the great guests that we have on. Further, I'd like to welcome all of you all to check us out on CityWorks XPO, that's cityworksxpo.com, and learn about our annual gathering, CityWorks 8, where this year's theme is Anticipating 2050, Acting Today. We're really excited about what we have going on this year and some of the speakers that we have coming in, and we hope you'll join us in Roanoke, Virginia from October 4th through 6th and be part of what's really a very special event. But for now, thanks again for listening and have a great week.